Well, again, good morning and welcome to Grace United Methodist Church. I'm Pastor Eric. It's your first time joining us. I just want to thank you. If this is I'm trying to come up with a new number besides 1,000. What's a good number?
277.
277. It's 277th time, which is like lower than 1,000.
Yeah.
I was hoping for like higher.
Yeah.
But, we thank you for being here regardless. If you're like really weirded out right now because I'm sitting in a chair in the service, it's not because I've done anything to my legs. I haven't done anything foolish. I haven't gone and run a crazy race that mandates this. But a few months ago, with all the changes that have been going on in the world and all the weirdness and all the things that have been going on for all of us, I started asking questions of our worship services and how we interact. We learned that roughly half of our folks are still watching us online every single week. Right now, I just checked as I was walking up, I counted 52 unique IP addresses watching us right now. And usually there's more than one person at about half of our sites who are watching us. And then our number has always doubled in the first 48 hours after worship services happened. And with the number of people here, we've been doing really well at connecting with people is what that tells us. And so one of the things that brought me to, and when we talked about mission and vision, was how do we do the service maybe in a way that helps connect people and bridge the gap? And so this morning, not in solidarity with all of our couch sitters, but in a way in which we try to connect with everybody in a unique way. We're going to be doing a sermon series for this month of November I'm calling the Conversationalist. And it's because somebody also come up to me and said, Eric, you're really great one-on-one. When you tell a pastor that, by the way, it makes it sound like your sermons are awful. It's to try to connect in that way. So we're going to do that. And each week I'm going to have somebody here helping ask questions, and I've got Greta with me. Say hi.
Good morning.
If you hadn't met Greta yet, Greta's in charge of our youth ministries, and she's been doing a great job. And she gets to ask like softball questions, and I get to answer them, right?
Yeah.
All right. So where are we starting?
We are starting with the ever so understandable concept of sin.
Wonderful.
You're welcome for that.
Oh my goodness.
So my first question, relatively basic. I think if we're going to talk about sin, we need to understand what sin is. So how do you quantify what sin is?
I love that you started saying qualify and quantify. If you're going to ask what a sin is, how many of you, when you think what is a sin, you think of a list of rules? Right? That's what I grew up with. I went to a Southern Baptist church, and I remember in Sunday school, like they brought it out like it was the school swimming pool rules. Do you remember seeing those as a kid? There's like 30 of those bad boys on that list, right? It just starts with don't run, and it doesn't get any easier from there. And I remember, we were seeing this list of things, and for a lot of us, when we think about what a sin is, we start thinking about a list of wrongs and rights. Because we think of our normal laws and our normal rules. Most of us, when we think of sin, we think of that. And our Judeo-Christian tradition begins that way. In the Old Testament, we had the 10 Commandments. What are those? Rules, right? And then they had on top of the 10 Commandments a whole host of other rules and norms that you had to follow. There was rules on everything. There was rules like, we bring up some of the simple ones like, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't murder, but they also had really weird and complex ones. Rules about what type of clothing you wear, right? Like right now in the Old Testament world, I am a massive sinner because ironically the clergy collar shirt that I'm wearing is a cotton polyester blend, and you shouldn't mix types of stuff together, right, for your fabrics. That was just not part of it. How many of you in this room love bacon? Yeah, every hand goes up except for the 2 vegetarians I've got, right? And even they, I think, in their heart love bacon. But you didn't eat bacon, and the rule wasn't so that you necessarily could be deprived of something so glorious, but because pork was so hard to properly produce, care for, cook, and treat that most people got sick. God's rules were about protecting you. Now, I bring all that up because when we ask what a sin is, we can choose to either look at it as a list of norms and rules of things that thou shalt and shalt not do, or You could look at it as the way I think a lot of us in the United Methodist Church look at it, especially a lot of my peers and colleagues. When we talk about sin, instead of breaking down a list of rules like you drove 36 and a 35, you're eternally going to the hot place. Instead of looking at it that way, we look at the breaking of relationship as what fundamentally a sin is. And when I look at it as the breaking of relationship, I think of 3 relationships. Now, most of you are like, I can see 2, and you're scratching your head like, how is he going to get a 3rd out of this? But the first one is the relationship between you and God, right? In the 10 Commandments, the first 5 are about your relationship with God. When we have people come to the church, the first thing I talk about is your relationship with Jesus, your relationship with God. That is the most paramount relationship I want to work on with you. And all of us have done things to fall short of that. All of us have done something to break that. The next relationship that is easy for us to deal with is our relationship with other people. How many of you ever messed up with somebody else? Not as many hands of bacon, but I'm pretty sure it's just as many. All right? We've all messed up relationships with people. There are still people I, am crabby with since like 5th grade. And we all have the horror stories of that in our lives. Broken relationships lead to tragedy. I've always freely shared this. One of my grandmothers, who's passed away since, she and her sister didn't talk for 30-something years. That's a tragedy. She didn't know that her sister had died for like 8. That's broken relationship right there. I don't know what did it, and I never asked because I don't want to know how crabby Grandma actually got. She was kind of a spitfire, but that brokenness is there. And every time I share that, by the way, someone always comes up to me after service and is like, that's me, or that's my uncle, or that's somebody they know. Broken relationships scar families and communities. Now, the third one is this, and this is the hard one. You can sometimes sin and break relationship with yourself. How many of you have ever done something that went against your nature, the identity of who you are? How many people do things that constantly harm themselves? And I'm not talking about just mental illness form of it, by the way. There are people who have genuine mental illness that causes them to do repetitive harm issues, but there's also times where we make poor decisions intentionally doing things that do not reflect the image of God that we were given. So when I think of sin, I think of it as whatever we're doing that breaks those relationships.
Thank you. That was a really good answer. So my next question, when we think about how sin affects relationships, all types in our lives, it's really easy to give a hierarchy to sin. And so I know growing up I was told, in God's eyes all sins are equal. And is that accurate?
How many of you want all sins to be equal? No one raises their hands ever. So in the Bible it does say, no sin is greater than any other, but this is the one we hate. This is the one we don't like. Why don't we like it? Because just like you want a list of rules of things you should and shouldn't do, you want to know how much trouble you're in, don't you? Right? If I go speeding down the road and I've broken that mythical 9-year fine, 10-year mine type of speed, I know that I've got to pay some cash at least, and the faster I go, the more severe the consequence. If I murder somebody, I'm likely to go to prison, and I'm not likely to get out. We want to have a weight to all of this, because a weight makes us feel better, I think. Now, I tell you that because we've always wrestled with this idea and this notion that some sins are greater than others, and in part because I think we want to justify not redeeming other people. If somebody tells what we consider a little white lie, right? That phrase, by the way, that little white lie, is because white is considered an image of purity, right? We've always conceptually had that. It's clean, it's virginal, or it's something that is pure and symbolic. And so for anything to have a scar on it or a blemish on it shows its imperfections. So when we say, I'm just telling a little white lie, we're actually negating the fact that a lie by its implicit nature does harm. We're trying to say that I can get away with a little bit of harm and be okay. But the thing is that all sins cause that separation of relationship between God, people, and self. And therefore, they're all just as culpable. I can tell a lie and do just as much damage and death as murdering somebody. And I might not know it at that moment. It might escalate and lead to something that is far more tragic. And so in that regard, yeah, no sin is greater than any other. And that being said, I don't advocate the big ones. Don't go out and try those and think you're going to have it easy. I think the human consequences of it are just as prevalent.
Thank you. So we all know that Christ died to redeem human sin. So knowing that Christ has given that gift to humankind, why are we not free to just go and sin all we want, knowing that that's already been paid for?
Yeah. How many of you want to go throw an epic raging party if you know that you're going to die tomorrow at 5 o'clock? Right? That's kind of the question. You know, if I know that God's going to forgive me no matter what is preventing me from going and living a wild and fun, in air quotes, all I can give it, life and existence, and sin and not worry about it until the very last second? So Jesus, in the teaching that he gives, he tells this parable. And in this parable, he talks about hired hands. Basically, a farmer, he goes to manpower. He hires a few people in the beginning of the day, and he says, I'm going to pay you $60 to work today. And then at noon, he realizes he's not going to get his fields done. So he goes back to manpower, and he hires another set of guys, and he says, I'm going to pay you $60 to work today. And then at 3 o'clock, he realizes that the sun is going to set, and he still won't have his job done. And if he doesn't get it done, he's going to lose the farm, right? Something drastic like that. So he goes back to manpower. He hires as many people as it takes to get the job done. He says, I'm going to pay you $60 to get the job done. Now, at the end of the day, the work is all done, and all the hired hands are out front, and the farmer comes up to the people who started last, and he starts paying them $60, $60, $60. Then he gets to the guys at noon, $60, $60, $60. He gets to the guys in the morning, $60, $60, $60. They all get $60. Doesn't that sound lovely? Anyone like that? None of the people liked it either. You know, Jesus tells this parable. He says that the people who started in the morning, they started grumbling. They said, Sir, didn't we work for you all day? Weren't we good enough is really what they're asking. To receive a little bit more, shouldn't our efforts for the entire day be worth more? And the guy goes, we agreed to this. We agreed to this. It's kind of the inverse of this for a moment. We get mad sometimes when somebody has a deathbed confession. Because we're like, man, that dude was a playboy his entire life, or he was greedy and a jerk. We don't like that Scrooge gets redeemed at the last second, do we? We sometimes get angry, especially if they don't have enough time to personally right their wrongs, because we're seeking to be the ones who give justice on other people. And what I want to argue is this, is one, we have to get past that first and foremost in our lives, because I think that's why this is such a hang-up for so many people, is because, especially those of us who are Christians, we're like, I'm living a good life, so should Bob across the street. I see what time Bob gets home. You know, I know what Bob was doing. There's a million Bobs that I know that are always mad at me for saying Bob. But we start with this idea. And we start with this concept that somebody has to be where we're at. And that's just not the case. I also want to argue this, that another narrative of Jesus' life is the woman at the well. The woman at the well, she goes to the well at noontime, the worst time of the day to go to the well, when the work is the hardest, when the thing is the hottest, when everyone else has already gotten all the fresh water. She goes there because she's wearing a scarlet letter. She's seen as a harlot in the community. And she finds Jesus there, which is an inappropriate conversation already. And Jesus in that moment asks her if she wants life-giving water. And in the offering of life-giving water in that moment, what he's also doing is saying, don't you want to live now as freely as you can? What I want to argue is that everyone thinks that they can live a happier, more enjoyable, more fulfilling life if they don't have to worry about sinning, and they can just get rid of it at the last second. For some reason, everyone thinks the party is where the sinning is, right? But I want to tell you it's not there. It might be fun for a season, but I've met so many people that feel hollow on the inside, that feel wiped out on the inside. And what Jesus is offering to her and to anyone else in those narratives of redemption and wholeness is the fullness of life that they had not experienced before. And so if you're wanting to acknowledge that you know what sin is and just keep sinning until you don't have to worry about it anymore, I would argue that you're actually rejecting the fullness of life that Jesus is trying to offer you in the here and the now. And I would argue that you don't really fully understand the concept of forgiveness. So for me, when you look at why is it important to find forgiveness as early in life as possible, it's so that you can have the fullness of life that Jesus offers us. That's what I preach on a regular basis. That's what I want to tell people all the time. You want the fullness of life? Let's start now. Let's start with all the places of your brokenness, and let's bring healing and restoration. Jesus was about resurrection and redemption, and sin keeps us in the brokenness. Jesus brings us out of that.
Wow. Okay. That was really good answer.
Sorry, that was more than we practiced.
No, it's okay. You just keep giving good answers. So one of the sins that you talked about most regularly, or in the context of the three, is sin against yourself, and kind of like that. So I know we talk a lot, or in the religious world, it's talked about a lot, original sin. And my question is, what is original sin, and do we believe in it?
All right. Anyone know the concept of original sin? Original sin is this. Are we born flawed is really what the question is about. Are we born sinful? Now, when you go see Bob across the street, you're like, that's a sinful old dude, right? It's pretty easy to see. But when we look at, like, my son Hadley, how many of you love Hadley running around this church? Oh, you all are like, he's so sweet and innocent. And I'm like, no. We can laugh about that because we don't want to see children as sinful. And the concept of original sin would say that everyone is born sinful, right? And that's what it's getting down to in this question. Do we have sin in the very nature of who we are? As United Methodists, we follow the works of a guy named John Wesley. And John Wesley wrote 2 sermons, both titled Original Sin, in which he actually consistently said that he believes in the concept of original sin because by our humanity and by our brokenness, we will always be sinful in nature. Now, the wrestling part for most of us then is at what point are we culpable? What part of our lives are we guilty for our sins? At what point do we have to take ownership for it? You know, growing up, I always learned that at 16 I could get my driver's license and 18 I could vote. That's really pertinent for people in like 2 days, right? How would you like to be born on November 5th? Womp womp, right? It's just not a good feeling. But here we talk about when is somebody mature enough to be responsible for their decisions. In the Jewish tradition, in the early Christian tradition, as well as in most religious traditions around the world, somewhere around the end of your puberty is the time in which you are mature enough to make decisions. I question that some days, having been around junior high and senior high people, but you know, there's somewhere in there is what we call the age of accountability. Now, if you follow strictly an age of accountability, what that age of accountability is you aren't guilty or you're not going to hell for your decisions until you've reached this age. And at some mythical moment, like a snap of a finger, you can now be processed for all your crimes, so to speak, for all of your sins. The problem with that is if you have a hardcore notion of that, you make some really bad theological decisions. Now, I'm not going to bring all those up because it will ruin my sermon. People will drove to turn this thing off. But just trust me, if you wrestled this one too far to the ground, it can lead to really heartbreaking, life-rendering decisions. So what I want to say is this. I want us to worry first about our own selves and not about somebody else, whether they're an infant or not. I want us to worry about where we cause breaking in our relationship, and where we, by our humanity, are flawed. I can ask for forgiveness in the morning, and 5 seconds later, be encountering something in my life that will cause me to need to ask for forgiveness again. Why? It's how I'm wired. The thing is I can still seek forgiveness. We have a loving God. I want to worry about that before I want to worry about how sinful is the kids around me or the infants around me, and what is the consequences eternally for that. Most people also, in that moment, I would argue, need to understand that our God is a forgiving and loving God, just like the workers of the field narrative, the people who ask for forgiveness at the last second, and those who were so young are never mentally culpable of understanding forgiveness. I think God's heart is big enough that his forgiveness is strong enough that we'll see more people in heaven than we realized.
Thank you. So Thinking about sin and our natural human tendencies to fall into temptation, do you think all sin is conscious?
All sin is conscious. Wow, that's a deep question. We didn't put that on the list. No. Are you aware of your sins when you make them? I think most of the time, yes. All the time, no. How many of you have ever done something on autopilot that you regretted later? Most of the time, I say this: I'm flexible enough to put both feet in my mouth. You ever done that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good day, right? And so I think some of that is that question of original sin in our brokenness. Are we always able to sin, whether we're consciously choosing to or not? And I would argue, yeah. Now, I come to that decision in large part understanding that every action that we have has consequences. Every action. And some of those consequences are good and some of them are bad. But every action. And so whether I intended it to do harm or not, if it did harm, it broke relationship. And so I have to be aware of the consequences of breaking that relationship.
Cool. So, I have nothing else to say to that. So, when thinking about sin and how we process it and how it's kind of talked about in the church, it's paired often with confession. And most times when people think of confession, they think of the little phone booth with the weird screen and the anonymity, I guess, to it. Do we, as Methodists, have a practice of confession? What does that look like for us?
We, as United Methodist, have confession, just not in the phone booth, right? In the confessional box, in the confessional room that they have. Now, as a pastor, like when I realized early on that I didn't have to sit in that little room and hear everybody's like horror stories, there was a part of me that was like, whoo-hoo! Smart choice, Eric, smart choice. But confession is valuable and vital. In the United Methodist Church, one of the things that not everyone catches is that when we celebrate Holy Communion, there is a confessional. If you're somebody who loves the traditional service, if you were to go grab our hymnal on page 13, halfway down, is the service of Word and Table number 2. It's the most commonly used one in the United Methodist Church in America. I have it memorized. And in it is the confessional. If you look at it, it's the confessional. And what it says is this, is that we must confess to God at minimum our sins. Now, I want to tell you something really important, and I've used this analogy a lot, is that the ability to confess is like the ability to speak truth to a sin or to a lie. A lie only has power over you, and a sin only has power over you when it's kept in the dark and when it's kept in secret. The minute you confess it and speak it out loud, it begins to lose its grip on you. You might have to bear the consequences of your actions, true, but its grip over you begins to die in the moment that you speak it out loud. And so the power of confessional, whether it's in the Catholic Church, whether it's in our Holy Communion, or whether you come to my office and you confess something, or you go to somebody and you confess something, your wrongs, whatever it is that you've done, the power of confessional is that you're breaking the power of that sin or that guilt or that shame over you. And in that moment that you speak its truth, you're beginning the restoration process. And so I'm actually an advocate of confession. I believe that it's needed. The only times I tell people not to, that you can't confess is one, an obvious one, when somebody else whoever you've harmed has passed away, so you might need to confess it to somebody else. Or if you're sharing it with whomever you have harmed, it might cause further harm, or that they can no longer be in a relationship with you if you have harmed them so greatly that being in relationship would cause further harm. So you got to be aware of some of those dynamics in it, but really confessional is powerful stuff. I won't be putting up walls and a little screen, and I won't be telling you how many Hail Marys to do or what will make it right. And I'm not knocking anyone who does that, but I'm just saying we as a church believe in confession, even if it looks a little different than what some stereotypes would show us.
Yeah. Jumping back to the original sin ideology, if all humans are intrinsically flawed and capable of making mistakes, when looking at Jesus as a person who was fully human and fully divine, was Jesus truly without sin? Was he truly without imperfections?
Yeah, what a fun question is that? How many of you think Jesus ever sinned? No one. Oh, we got like 3 hands up. All right. I like to laugh. I read a fictional book one time called Lamb, the Gospel According to Biff, Christ's Childhood Pal. And it's hilarious because it deals with the idea of whether Jesus as a child could be tempted to sin. They have this great little story of Biff moving to town, and he sees two brothers playing, and the younger brother has this lizard, and he's moving it back and forth, and then he bashes the lizard's head on a rock, it kills the lizard. The older brother grabs the lizard, sticks it in his mouth, pulls it out, and the lizard's alive again. You see this happen a couple times, and Biff comes up to them and says, "Can I do that?" And Jesus replies, "Which part?" It's comical in how it deals with the humanity of this. And that's what we're dealing with, is how human was Jesus. In our Christian faith, and in most Christian faiths, we believe that Jesus was fully divine and fully human. To believe that he's fully divine is to believe that he was without sin. So that it makes it easy. But how do you believe that he's fully human if he doesn't know sin? Well, if you go back to the story of Adam and Eve, before they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the center of the garden, they did not know sin. They knew temptation. They knew all the other things that you could know, but they didn't know sin yet. That choice to break that relationship or to harm that relationship. And so what I would argue is that Jesus was aware of and experienced all the temptation in the world. He experienced all the joy and all the pain. But in the choosing of his actions and in the way in which he had relationship, then he would have been without sin. People always, when I bring this up, bring up the fact that Jesus flipped over money changers and got a bullwhip into the temple. I want to tell you, he had divine anger. Divine anger is not necessarily sin. Anger isn't necessarily sin. What you do with your anger can lead you to sin. Emotions intrinsically aren't sinful in their nature. They are uncontrollable response. But what we do with that anger, that can lead us to sin or not. Right? So when a car passes me on the road and cuts me off really close, I have choices to be made in that moment. How many of you make really good choices in that moment? No hands. No one even tries. Right? But we have choices to be made. I can be angry in that moment because I'm disappointed in somebody, but how I respond to it is vital. Jesus was responding to a social justice issue at that moment. The social justice issue is that the money changers and the people selling in the temple were exploiting people who are already in poverty, offering them imperfect animals to make sacrifices with, charging them exorbitant rates. They were abusing their system of power and privilege in the temple, and Jesus wasn't going to have any of it. And so he ran them out of the temple. Jesus is always protecting those who are hurt, always those who are being marginalized and taken advantage of. And I think that is just an example of where we can get confused with the nature of Jesus in that moment.
So essentially, Jesus was just the best decision maker to ever exist.
Sure.
Cool.
Yeah, all right.
Cool.
What would Jesus do? Like, bracelets really were important.
Yeah. When it's easy to kind of understand personal sin and sin on kind of a ground level as we experience it.
Yep.
But sin also exists corporately and institutionally.
Yeah.
And as a person who's leading an institution of faith, how do you understand corporate sin, and how do you try and enact right in those situations?
Yeah. So this is always a hard one because communities have always wrestled with this. In the Old Testament, God got angry at his entire people group because the entire Jewish nation was sinning at the time, right? And we read that and we don't want to ever face that in our day, and I don't think they wanted to face it back then either. But what we can do as people is we can cause harm against other groups of people. In American history, you can look at Americans' version of slavery and really see how that was a sinful institution causing harm to people. John Wesley, our founder, was one of the first people to rail against that in a very powerful way. He advocated that his pastors never take up that practice, never own slaves themselves, and to decry it as an evil. And honestly, one of the first separations of the Methodist movements was over slavery in America. We had the Methodist Church of the South and everyone else. And it really created harm. And we've repented of that in the past. As a weird position that I've held in the conference, I've designed worship for the last 8 years for our annual conference. And one of the things that we did was a special service of asking for forgiveness to indigenous peoples. This was to Native Americans in our context, but this happened around the world at annual conferences. So like in Africa, the tribal people, for the times in which we've done harm, stolen land, hurt people, spread disease. We've taken advantage of people, and so we've had to ask for forgiveness. I believe institutions can do harm. Oftentimes when we're seeking just like individually for our own privilege and power often is what the corrupting tool is. And we believe that we're so right or we're so powerful that sometimes we might be right, but we're even doing it in the wrong way. And for those times we have to ask for forgiveness. It also means those people who are in seats of power like me, when I get to make decisions, I have to be keenly aware of not only making the right decision, but making it in the right way. Bringing the right voices to the table, making sure that we're not causing further harm. And so that's a really powerful role that we have to have and take ownership of. And I just pray that people do that. Your actions need to have integrity to go along with them. And one of the best lines I ever heard in a leadership seminar is that integrity is a volume knob. You can choose to turn it up or down. And your actions are what do that, not your words. And so I believe that we as leaders, to help prevent having corporate sin as a community, need to really be on ownership of our integrity.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Awesome.
When facing institutional sin or sin on an interpersonal level, how do we, as people who are striving to live like Christ, how do we call out sin in an appropriate, loving manner?
Well, historically, the people of God have called out sin in whatever way wakes people up. So sometimes you've had the street corner preacher. How many of you have seen the street corner preacher? Right? He's out in the corner standing next to the bar. I was at Peoria First United Methodist Church for 6 years, and for 3 of those years, Big Al's was across the street. And I just have to say that name. Most people know what it is. It was a strip club, right? And we had guys at our church who would stand there with signs, and not all of them were effective. So sometimes we have people that try to do that. But in the Old Testament, there are some fascinating ways that sin is called out. Sometimes it's really direct, right? Going up to Solomon and telling him of his sinfulness. Even going up to David and confronting, hey, David, you committed adultery and murder. Good luck with this one, right? That's calling it out and naming it for people. That's an important thing to do. But sometimes the corporate group sin that's been called out, in the prophets, one of the prophets was called to spend a year laying on his side, cooking his food with his own feces. That was considered a sermon message to the people. I don't think I'm brave enough to do that, just so you know. But sometimes it's something that's shocking, and to bring awareness to the people around them and to let them know the depth of what the sin is. That is a really disgusting thing to do. And for a prophet of God to defile himself, where everything he's taking in is marked by being unclean, is what he was saying. And what he was saying in that moment is that you, my people of God, are that unclean, that everything you're taking into you is of filth, of waste. And that was a powerful message, and it hopefully would wake people up. Sometimes we need to speak or act creatively in a way that wakes people up to their sinfulness.
Well, that's all the questions that I have. Thank you. I think, this gives a much clearer understanding of what sin looks like in adult life. I know that kind of third grade Sunday school sin can look a lot different than what it looks like after this conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank